Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the first day in eyeshadow palette week. It is that time again where every single day for the next 7 days I will be posting eyeshadow related content. The Sephora VIB sale is going on right now, so therefore a video might get snuck in about the Sephora VIB sale, and then we'll just extend palette week by a day. So there might be like one day where it's Sephora sale content over palette content. I hope you guys will understand, but I thought it would be fun to kick off eyeshadow palette week by sharing with you all of the current eyeshadow pans scattered throughout my eyeshadow collection. I currently have 32 eyeshadow palettes with one or more pans, and then I also have some singles throughout my collection with pan, and I thought it would be fun to share that with you today. So if you are interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like palette themed content, project panning content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I would love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's get into all of the eyeshadow pans in my collection. Okay, I added some lip gloss and I'm feeling so much better. I haven't talked at all today, like to anyone. So my voice is like just warming up. Please bear with me on that. I do apologize. Like I said, I do have 32 eyeshadow palettes in my collection currently with pan. I will share all of the eyeshadow pans in my collection, and then at the end of the video I have sprinkled in a little bit more data and statistics if you're a data and statistics type of a gal like me. But let's just get going in no particular order other than like what's set out in front of me. Up first, we have my Novelist Side by Side palette. I personally love this eyeshadow palette, and I'm surprised I only have one pan currently in this palette. It is this one right here. This is in the shade Party. And I actually feel like I don't necessarily have any significant dips in any of the other shades in this palette. The pans are like not super shallow, but also not super deep. But obviously this was something I used to set my lids every single day. I've reached for this palette a ton. Some of the like shimmer or glitters in this are a little bit chunkier than your average like metallic shade. So if I really focused on this palette, I feel like I could have so many more pans in this. And maybe we'll swing back to this at some point this year to achieve that, but that's where we're at in my Novelist Side by Side. Both of my Persona palettes each have at least one pan. So actually we'll start with Identity 1 to go like in order. In my Persona Identity 1, I have a pan right here in the shade Fearless. I mostly use this as a brow setting shade or a lower lash liner. I have gotten a ton of use out of this palette. I still have the old packaging, but I feel like the quality in this still performs really well. And I would love to see a couple more pans in this palette by the end of the year. And then my Identity 2 palette, I have a pan on the shade Kind up here, which is obviously another lid setting shade. I do feel like I could, with a little bit of effort, have more pan in this palette as well. I love the neutrals in this palette, but I love that you get your pops of color as well. So perhaps both of my Persona palettes will have more pan by the end of the year. I just have one Odin's Eye palette in my collection currently with pan. It comes from my Soul Main palette, and I did break this shadow or break this shade, so that's a whole pan. But I also have pan in this shade right here, which again, another lid setting shade. You'll see tons of lid setting shades with pan throughout my collection, as well as like brow shades. I do love this palette, and I'm hoping maybe like this mauve shade would be the next one that I would hit pan in. I don't have a ton of Juvia's Place palettes in my collection. I do have the Nomad palette though, and I have a pan on this shade down here, which again is a brow, kind of like a brow shade for me. That's mostly what I use this one for. From Alter Ego, I do have one pan in one of my Alter Ego palettes. It is in the shade Expanse, which is in my Canyon palette. Again, a brow setting shade, and I am currently working on the shade Desert Sun in my Pan Those Eyeshadow series. So hopefully this one will have another pan. Another palette I'm working on in my Pan Those Eyeshadows currently is the Pat McGrath Rose Decadence palette. I am working on this shade in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, so I have a good dip in here. But 2 years ago in 2020, I hit pan in this shade up here. The Pat McGrath pans are pretty deep, so I feel like it's gonna take some good effort to hit pan in this one, but hopefully we'll have 2 pans in this by the end of the year. My Tarte Love Trust and Fairy Dust palette, I have 2 pans in this palette. I have pan on this lid setting shade, as well as this matte kind of mid-toned warmer brown shade. I do really enjoy this palette. It is a palette going on my Palettes on the Last Two Raw series. That'll be linked below. I will be updating that this week, and potentially more pan in this by the end of the year as well. I was kind of surprised. I only have 3 Huda palettes currently with pan on them. I think I've decluttered I've decluttered some ABH palettes with like serious pan in it, and like when I do videos like this I get a little bit sad. I'm like, oh, I decluttered so many palettes with pan out of my collection, but then I'm like, but girl, you weren't using those anymore. Anyway, my Huda Gemstone Obsession palette, this just has a broken shade, but I do count this as a pan because the pan is there. Also, my Huda medium palette, I do have a pan right up here. The Huda eyeshadow, at least the Obsessions palettes, the pans are rather shallow, so it's not all that difficult to hit pan on these. So I could definitely see myself hitting pan potentially in some of the metallic shades in this palette, because I do enjoy that one quite a bit. And then my Huda Coral Obsessions palette, I'm also working on in my pan those eyeshadows. I'm working on this shade right here, but I already had a pan on this shade in this palette. This is one I used to take traveling with me all of the time, so it definitely got a lot of use for me. And yeah, hopefully some more pan in this palette's future as well. Next up, I have this Kat Von D Alchemist Holographic palette. So I currently only have one eyeshadow pan in this palette right here, but all three of these have really significant dips, and I anticipate by the end of this year there will be a pan in all four of these. I love this palette for inner corner highlights. That's like all I use this palette for, but it is like one of my favorite palettes in my collection, just because I use it so frequently anytime I create a pink look. And unless it was during the time I was trying to pan a different inner corner highlight from the Natasha Denona Mini Love palette, I reached for pink opal. If I do a purple look, I use ultraviolet. Blue, obviously I use blue sapphire quite frequently, and then there's a green one as well. I love this palette. Next time I film this style of video, I anticipate there will be a pan in every single pan in this palette. I have two Too Faced palettes that currently have pan. Up first, I have the Palm Springs Dreams palette, and I just have pan in the shade Cabana Time, which is again a lid setting shade. Not too exciting there. And then I think this is another lid setting shade in my Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes. Yes, I have pan in the shade Swan right here, which again is another lid setting shade. I have used this palette a ton, but due to how firmly pressed Too Faced shadows are, it'll probably be a long time before there's any more palettes or any more pans joining this palette. A recent pan in my collection comes from my Trace Luce the I Am palette, and I have pan in the shade Grateful right here, which is a really beautiful shimmery blue shade. I use that as a lower lash liner, and it's a pretty crumbly shade, so I hit pan really quickly in that shade, but nevertheless I'm very excited to have that pan. In my BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival palette, this is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, and I've had it for quite some time, so it's gotten a ton of use as well. This one has 3 eyeshadow pans in it. I have pan on the shade Trixie, which I quite frequently use as an inner corner highlight, as well as Boho, which I really like as like a medium mid-tone like crease shade, and then also Boho, which I love as an all over lid shade. My go-to look with this palette is to use these 2 shades as well as this to deepen up the look, and then use Trixie in the inner corner. I have done that look so many times. It's like one of the most repeated looks probably in like my entire makeup life, and that's how I got the 3 pans in this palette. I lied, I actually have 3 Too Faced palettes with pan on them. In my Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette, all of my Too Faced palettes, it's always a lid setting shade. Probably because the shadows are so firmly pressed. That's the only type of shade I'm gonna hit pan on in a Too Faced palette, but I have pan on the shade Whipped Cream right here. I have 1 Dose of Colors pan, there's so many P words in this video, and again, this is the first time I'm talking today. From Dose of Colors, the Baked Browns palette. I have 2 pans in this one, a lid setting shade with pretty significant pan on it, and then also the shade Deserted, again with pretty significant pan on it. This is one, again, like in 2019, I took this traveling with me so frequently. This shade right here has a pretty significant dip on it. It would be really cool to pan this entire palette. This one I probably could use as a brow shade and get some pan on that by this year. Maybe my goal should be this palette as well as the Kat Von D Holographic palette. All the pans need to have pan by the end of the year. From Marc Jacobs, this one has a new pan in it. This is the Electric palette. I have pan, I don't know if you'll even be able to see, it's such a sliver of a pan, in the shade The Rhythm, but I also have pan in the shade Rock Out, and I actually really enjoyed this palette. It has very deep shades, or the pans are very deep, so it takes effort to hit pan in this these palettes, and I'm very proud of myself that I have 2 in this one. From Colored Rain, I have another like super baby pan in this palette. I have pan on the shade Crown, which you honestly can barely tell because this shadow looks so similar to the actual pan. Like you can barely tell that there's pan, but the pan is there. And this I feel like took me forever to hit pan on as well. I used to think I was gonna hit pan on a ton of shades throughout this palette, but I look at Royal Prerogative, which is probably my second most used shade in this palette, and I'm not even close to pan because the pans in this are pretty deep as well. But nevertheless, I'm very excited to have a pan in that one. I have one Urban Decay palette with mini pans, and it is my Born to Run palette. This is another one that's going in my palettes on their last 2 raw, and I have 3 eyeshadow pans in this palette. I have Blaze, which I used quite frequently as an inner corner highlight. I hit pan on that last year. I believe I also hit pan on the shade Good Is Gone last year, which I used mostly in my brows. And then I had the pan in the shade Riff. I think I hit this maybe in 2019 or 2020. And this is just like, again, that kind of like medium warm brown shade that I really like. But this palette takes effort to hit pan on. These shades are pretty firmly pressed and also very deep. So to have 3 pans in this palette makes me very proud. I have 2 Melt palettes with pan on them. Up first, we can look at my Melt Mary Jane. I have pan on the shade Sinsemilla, right here. Obviously a brow shade, a brow powder shade, and then same thing in my Melt Rest palette, it is a brow powder shade as well. I have a pan on the shade Mar, which is actually probably way too warm for my brows, so I'm a little bit embarrassed that I use that for my brows. I could probably go into Rot 2 and try and hit pan on that as a brow shade this year as well. And when I say brow, if I'm saying brow bone, I mean like brow powder. I'm not going to go back and correct every time I feel like I said brow bone throughout this video. All right, and then we're down to the last 10 palettes. I have 5 Natasha Denona palettes with pan and 5 ABH. Let's jump into ABH because I have so many eyeshadow pans throughout my ABH collection. First up, we have the Master palette by Mario, and I have half of this palette with pan. I have 6 shades in this palette with pan. I have Lula, Isabel, Violetta, Muse, and Fifth Ave, as well as Marina. Would love to hit pan on the majority of the rest of these shades before the end of the year. This is another palette that's going in my palettes on their last 2 raw, and this is so old. I really do just need to declutter it, but now I'm like, this accounts for like so many eyeshadow pans in my collection. Should I, like, I can't declutter it, but I need to. My ABH Norvina palette, I have 2 pans. I have pan on the shade Base, obviously a lid setting shade, and then I also have pan on the shade Dreamer, which I used quite a bit as both an inner corner highlight, but also all over the lids. I do have pretty significant dips throughout this palette and feel like with a little bit of effort, I could hit some more pans this year. This is something that I have toyed with including in my palettes on their last 2 raw, and I feel like I meant to include it this year, but then forgot. So maybe I'll be potentially rolling this into my palettes on their last raw. I just can't decide if I want to keep this palette in my collection. I probably do. I feel like every time I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna declutter this, then I'll use it, and I'm like reminded how much I actually do enjoy this palette. My ABH Carly palette, I also have 2 pans on. Yes, I have pan on the shade Bully as well as the shade Bear, again a lid setting shade and mostly an inner corner highlight. Sorry, I also have pan on the shade Moo as well, which I used mostly all over the lids. I feel like with a little effort, I could potentially hit pan on the shade Chai and definitely expand some of the pans. But this is another palette that I'm just like, I don't know how much it inspires me in my collection. My Abh Sultry palette is one of my favorite palettes of all time, favorite palettes in my collection, and I have 4 eyeshadow pans in this palette, and I've used this palette a lot, like a lot. So I'm really surprised that I only have 4 pans in this one. I have pan on the shade Fresh, a pretty significant pan. Again, a lid setting shade. Also Twig, which is another matte shade, Dystopian, and then also Pearl, which I used mostly as an inner corner highlight. I am hoping maybe I could have half of this palette with pan by the end of the year. Maybe that would be a goal. And then my Abh Jackie palette, I used this palette for part of my look today. This is like one of my favorite palettes in my collection as well. And shockingly, I only have 1 pan in this palette, and it's on the shade Soleil. I use this mostly as an inner corner highlight. This is a palette I find myself feeling like I can't reach for unless it's a special occasion, because I love it that much and I do that thing. So I feel like if I like allowed myself to reach for it as often as I like want to, it sounds so ridiculous to say these things out loud, but I feel like I would have a lot more pan in this palette. But I just do that thing where for some reason I reserve my right to use this palette that frequently. I do feel like this will probably be my next pan in this palette. This is the shade Ginger, and I do have a pretty significant dip on that, but I also really want to use the shade Zam more frequently just because it's so beautiful. So hopefully we'll have more pan in this palette by the end of the year. So that just brings me to my Natasha Denona palettes with pan. Up first, I have my ND Gold palette. I absolutely love this palette. And I have pan on this shade right here, which actually I could flip this over, and it's the shade Sandstone. These pans are super, super deep, so it takes so much effort to hit pan on this. This, I feel like if I was just like not a makeup collector and just like did my makeup the same every single day, like I could have this pan or this palette in my collection, use this every single day and be perfectly satisfied with it, just because there's such a variety of like neutral browns, which is like my go-to. I have my like fun greens that I can play around with from time to time, but also like my neutral-ish like shimmer shades for the lid. Like I just love this palette so much. So I should show it even more love and have more than one pan on it, right? Also, my Natasha Denona Sunrise palette I have a pan on. I have a pan on the shade Laurel right here, which is a really beautiful all over the lid shade. That is mostly what I used it for. I also used it like as an inner corner. I love this palette as well. I love the majority of my Natasha palettes. And this one I feel like actually looks pretty dirty and pretty used. Like as I look at it in the viewfinder, I'm like, okay, like yeah, there's quite a bit of like disturbance throughout at least the shimmer shades. So that one's gotten some love, but again, thick pans, so only one actual pan in that palette. My Natasha Denona Mini Nude Eyeshadow Palette. This is, I dropped this, so it's like very broken, but I have pan in this shade. I think I'm just gonna, like, I never know how to read the back and which label correlates to which shade, but these two shades right here, with an ounce of effort this summer, because I reached for this so frequently last summer, I see myself reaching for this a ton again this year. I kind of just want to repurchase this palette because it's so broken, but I would also just rather continue to use this because I can. What I'm trying to get at is I could see myself for sure hitting pan in this shade, as this is already like so broken. I could see myself having pan in this shade as well, so that's where we're at with that one. My Natasha Denona Mini Love Palette. I recently hit pan on the shade You Are My True right here, which is a really beautiful inner corner highlight. It has this like, it's like a champagne with a hint of pink. So I would do like a neutral eye look, and then I would pop this in the inner corner, and it would just like bring like a hint of pink to the look, and I just absolutely adored what this added to a look. So I'm very happy with that pan. And then the final pan in my palette collection before we get into my singles comes from my Natasha Denona Mini Retro palette, and I have pan on this shade right here, which I believe is Vintage Taupe. Such a beautiful like mauve-y, like cool toned mauve shade. I've also used this shade quite a bit, and this one has a good amount of disruptance as well, so I could see myself with more pans in this palette as well by the end of 2022. All right, so that just brings me to my single shadow collection then. I only have 9 pans throughout my single shadow collection. My single shadows I'm trying to focus on a little bit more heavily this year. Sometimes my single shadow collection gets lost in the shuffle, but to kick it off, I have an eyeshadow, oh geez, this is gonna get so messy I feel like. I have a pan in the shade On Ice from Give Me Glow Cosmetics. It's a really, really beautiful champagne shade that I use a lot as an inner corner highlight, but also as a face highlighter. And that took effort. Like I know that the pans are large, but I didn't know, like I didn't feel like they were like that deep until you get to working on these shades, and then like you think you're gonna hit pan every day for months, and then pan never comes. Next up, I don't know, I think I depotted this shade from like a palette because there's nothing on the back to tell me what, like where this came from, but just an all over lid setting shade, pretty significant pan on that one. I also have this shimmery pink shade, which I used quite a bit as an inner corner highlight. I believe this came from an old Pure palette, but I want to say maybe it was like the Artistry 2, but I could be very wrong on that. but that was a depotted shade as well. From Adept Cosmetics, I have pan on the shade ACD5. Hopefully the camera will focus. There we go. There we go. A beautiful pan on this shade. I absolutely adored this shade. It has like hints of blue, purple, and pink. And oh, I like really want to reach for that shade again, like right now. And then this one is like not coming out of this palette I have it in, but I have this one right here. I have a pan in this shade, which came out of my Alamar Cosmetics palette, the first one. I can't remember what this name of this shade was called, but I used this again as an inner corner highlight quite a bit, and I do have a pan there. I hope you can see. Is it focusing? Maybe, hopefully, yes. There we go, a pan. And then to wrap it up, I have my ColourPop singles. All of these are like depotted out of different ColourPop palettes, and I have 6 pans in, and I have 6 pans throughout my ColourPop collection. Actually, one of them is like an actual ColourPop single, and that one was in the shade Glass Bowl. So here is Glass Bowl, and then I have a depotted shade out of the I think the Elsa palette from one of the Frozen palettes. I also have a shade out of the Dream Street palette I use as a brow setting shade. I have these 2 shades right here, which came from the ColourPop Sweet Peach palette. And then, is that it? Do I only have 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wow, I suck at counting. Yep, just 5, not 6. So those are all of the eyeshadow pans in my collection. I'm really excited to kind of revisit this at the end of 2022 and to see how many more pans are in my collection. If you follow my Pan Those Eyeshadow series, I will always have my pan percentage listed in the description box. But to end this video with just a little bit of statistics or math sprinkled in, I currently have 160 eyeshadow palettes in my collection. 32 of those have a pan on them. That means only 20% of my palette collection has pan in the palettes. Throughout my palette collection, I have 1,628 eyeshadow pans. That was a little bit jarring when I finally redid my like single shadows and listed everything out, and 53 of those currently have pan on them, meaning that 3.2% of my palette collection, like there's 3.2% of the eyeshadows in my collection have pan on them. If you add my single shadows in, I have 1,766 shadows in my collection. 61 of them have a pan, meaning that in total 3.45% of my eyeshadow palette collection has a pan. That's not a lot at all. What should my goal be? 5%? Like that seems like the natural progression. Then I'm like thinking about like palettes I would potentially be decluttering with a lot of pan, but then also if you declutter, you're getting rid of that, you know how it all works, math. Anyway, that is where my collection stands with pan. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if we have any overlapping pans. Like, do you have some of the same pans in your collection? How many pans do you have in your eyeshadow palette collection? Do you track that? I would love to know in the comments. Let me know what other palette themed content you would be interested in seeing on my channel. My eyeshadow palette playlist will be linked down below. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel, as you always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.